In this lesson, we are going to be looking at factor by grouping, and I want you to recall what we have been studying. We have been studying how do you factor polynomials. We have made it through everything. You always start with the greatest common factor. Then you look to see how many terms the polynomial will have. So 3 terms, you use guess and check method. 2 terms, you check for difference of squares. And now we are going to look at what happens when you have 4 terms. And you can see here it says use the grouping method of factoring. So, before we actually look at factor by grouping, I would like for you to look at these 2 problems. It says to factor. Well, as you can see, you're going to clearly take out the greatest common factor. So, you can see that this has a 3 in common in both pieces. So you actually factor out the 3, and then it is a times b inside of parentheses. So if I distribute back, I get 3a, and if I distribute back, I get 3b. So you're probably thinking, well, I already know how to do that. That is an easy example. So now that you understand how to do a greatest common factor, I'm going to challenge you to look at what we just did. 3 and 3 were in common to both pieces, to both terms. 3 and 3 simply came out front, they came together here, and A and B are your leftovers that fall into the parentheses. It's factoring, it's backwards distributive property. So now on this one, I'll challenge you to look at the 4 and the 4 are in common. So you take the 4 out, and your leftovers fall into the parentheses. So now if you look at this one, you may not see that as clearly. When you look at this, your first probably thought is to go ahead and put it back together. But remember, factoring is breaking things apart. So I need you to realize that these 2 are the same. They are just like these 4's up here. So we factored the 4's out front and the leftovers went down. Well, look here. These are in common to both pieces, just like up here. So we can bring these out. They're both in common. And then it would be x plus 4 times what? Well, 2x minus 3. So we brought out what we had in common, put it out front, and the leftovers fell into the parentheses. But now watch how the distributive property will work. If I distribute this to this, then I get the 2x times x plus 4 back. If I distribute the x plus 4 to the negative 3, I get that exact same thing back. So you need to understand the concept of factoring out the greatest common factor. So look at everything that I have highlighted, it came out front. These came out front. You had matches. So that match, the greatest common factor, came out front. Then you completed the factoring process. So now let's slide to the notes and look up here. It says recall. So let's go to number 1. You can clearly see here the problem that we just talked about. The x plus 4's are in common. Therefore, you can bring out the x plus 4, and then your leftovers, 2x minus 3, will just go inside. So common factors come out front, 2x minus 3, your leftovers comes here. When you distribute back, you get the same exact problem. So now look at number 2. You have a match x minus 8, x minus 8, but you'll notice there's nothing with this x minus 8 here. So there is an understood 1 there when I factor this back out. So I have a match, my greatest common factor comes out, leftovers goes in, so you've got to remember that there is a 1 there. And remember, if I were to distribute the x minus 8 back out, I would get x times x minus 8, and I would get 1 times x minus 8. Now finally, number 3, you can clearly see the match. You have a y minus 2 and a y minus 2. So you bring that one out. That's what you have in common. And here, 3y squared plus 5 simply falls in. Those are your leftovers. Now, you have to understand that before you can actually group. Now, the first thing you look at here on your notes, it says factor completely, and it has a polynomial with 4 pieces. So, you just simply group them. Now, the rules are your polynomial needs to be in standard form. Remember, that is in descending order by degree. And you group things together to see if you can find matches. So, this is what I mean by group things together. You are going to group these two together, and you are going to group these two together. So basically, you're splitting them down the middle. So we are going to ignore this side, and we are going to factor the first two. So this has an x cubed and an x squared. So an x squared will come out, and we are left with x plus 1. Then we factor this one. A 2 is the greatest common factor. When we factor this out, we get an x plus 1. This 2 is a positive. And look what we have created. We have created a factoring problem just like up here. Do you see these matches? Well, do we have matches? If we have a match, that means we have a greatest common factor. So once again, here and here. So that's the greatest common factor. It comes out front. Here, x squared plus 2 will fall in the middle. And if you were to distribute this back out to check, you would in fact get this 4 polynomial. So that's it for grouping. You just split down the middle, factor the first two, factor the second two, look for a match, factor it again. So now, I would like for you to pause the video and try number 2. Okay, now after you looked at it, you may have got stuck here because you may have thought that you messed up. Because what I have successfully done is I have factored the beginning 2 here, but I have nothing to factor here. So you must factor the both sides. So what you do is you put a parenthesis around that and you pretend that you take a 1 out of it. So now we have matches again. So we have the y minus 9 and the y minus 9, and we just put a 1 there. So now I bring the match out, and then I have y squared plus 1, and then I look at it. Once again, if I do the distributive property, I will check and get back the polynomial that I started with. Okay, now let's look at number 3. Number 3 is going to have multiple steps in it. So here is our problem. X cubed minus 2x squared minus 9x plus 18. So it is a polynomial with 4 terms. So it's like banana split. Split it right down the middle. Look at this side first. I have an x squared in common. And then I would have an x minus 2 here. And now here I have a negative 9x and I have a positive 18. Well, remember, I never want that leading coefficient to be negative. So I always factor out a negative if that is the case. So I am going to factor out a negative 9. And what happens is that turns positive, but this one will be a negative 2 because negative 9 times negative 2 is positive 18. And luckily, I now have a match. So I can bring the match out, x minus 2, and I write my leftovers in. But I am not finished. Do you recognize difference of squares right here? So I have to keep going. So this can happen if you have difference of squares. So I keep this factor alone, but I realize difference of squares, x and x, 3 and 3, plus, minus, following my difference of squares pattern. Now, the reason why I did not do that with the questions 1 and 2, I did not have a difference of squares. So you only do that here. So you must be alert for that to happen. Now, I'm going to slide over to number 4. Here we go. It is x cubed plus 3x squared minus 6x minus 18. So this is just a normal grouping problem. Pause the video, try that one by yourself. Okay, I split it right down the middle. I factored out an x squared. I got x squared times x plus 3. This was a negative, so I factored out a negative 6, and then I ended up getting an x plus 3. I brought my match out, my greatest common factor, and I wrote the leftovers down. Except this time I have the word stop here because I do have a difference, but 6 is not a perfect square. So that is the final answer for number 4. Now, question 5. Question 5 is going to be one that involves more than just the x variable. So this one is 3a squared plus ab squared minus 3ab minus b cubed. Now, this one looks like a very intimidating problem, but you just follow your grouping rules. So is it in standard form? Remember your standard form rules. So we have everything here in alphabetical order. The b squared will overtake this one. So now we're ready to group. We split it in half. Look at this first part. I have an a in common, and it looks like a is the only thing I can take out. So a times 3a plus b squared. Now here I have a negative in common and I have a b in common. So b times 3a, and then this would turn to a positive b squared. So I divided a b out of everything. Now, as I look at this, I'm very happy to see that those two factors are indeed identical. So I can factor those out. So 3a plus b squared times a minus b. Once again, I do not have difference of squares, so I stop and then go from there if I needed to, but I have to stop on this one. Now, the very last problem, please write this one down. It is 8x cubed minus 16x squared minus 2x plus 4. Now, as I look at this one, hopefully you can realize something. When we are factoring, we always look for the greatest common factor first. Now remember, if you don't do that first, you're just creating more work for yourself in the end. But I'm realizing that everything has a 2 in common. So the first step would be take the 2 out. So I would get 4x cubed minus 8x squared minus x plus 2. Now I still have a polynomial with 4 terms, so I can still group it. Now we're going to ignore this 2 for just a minute. We're going to add that back into our answer down at the bottom. So for right now, let's just focus on grouping these two parts. So I have a 4 in common and x squared in common. So it is x minus 2. Here, I never want that negative, so take out the negative, and it looks like I can only take out a negative 1, so I get x minus 2. So now, all of this would be in parentheses, but I'm going to go ahead and take out my match, x minus 2, and write down my 4x squared minus 1. And remember, this 2 is still part of the problem. So now I realize, okay, I'm almost finished, but then I look at this right here. What is up with 4x squared minus 1? Well, that is difference of squares, so I have to keep going. So I write down all of these factors, and now I focus on this piece. 2x times 2x will give me 4x squared, 1 and 1 will give me 1, plus minus will make the bottom, or make the middle cancel out. So when it's all said and done, we have 4 pieces to this one problem. We have a 2 times x minus 2 times 2x plus 1 times 2x minus 1. So that's just it for grouping. You split it down the middle, factor each piece, then factor out your matching pair.